Welcome to another episode of Was It That Bad?, the series where we look at a game which released to mixed reception and go back in time to answer the ultimate question: was it really that bad? Today we're looking at the sequel to the 1997 original Blood 2: The Chosen, released in 1998. Now this was a good year for PC gaming in general, but especially for first-person shooters. We got Half-Life, Unreal, Sin, and depending on your playstyle, Thief: The Dark Project, just to name a few. Now, all of these released to critical acclaim and are still very playable in modern times, with several spurring on the creation of subsequent games in the franchise, because these titles were, at the time, all new franchises. However, Blood 2 was not a new franchise. It was building off the success of the first game, which was generally well received. Alas, the sequel was set 100 years in the future and took on a very different overall feel to the original game. And it was perhaps this overall feel, or character as some outlets put it, which was one of the main reasons that it wasn't reviewed particularly kindly by many outlets, with several reviewers scoring it well below 50% of their respective rating systems. Now today we're going to be playing through the launch version of Blood 2, exclusively focusing on the single player campaign component of the game, but there are obvious parallels which you'll be able to see in the overall gameplay, which extends to multiplayer. It's worth mentioning that getting this game to run on a modern PC is not an easy task. It is possible, but requires a lot of tinkering, including creating your own batch files to patch the master executable. It's definitely not impossible, however there is very limited information online, and a lot of what I had to do was trial and error, so please do consider that if you are considering playing it on modern hardware. I'll drop a link to the most helpful article I found in the comments, however I do want to stress that even using this, it was trial and error. Before we continue, a massive thank you to those who support the channel. If you enjoy this type of content, please do consider subscribing. It helps support the channel, and you can be notified of new content the moment it drops. With that out of the way, let's begin. Now, outside of a large text dump in the manual, there isn't much of a visible story in the first Blood game, and to be honest, for what it was at the time, a fast-paced action shooter, this was fine. After all, Duke Nukem 3D did the same, and that was a masterpiece. So what does Blood 2 do differently with its story? Well, a lot, and it's good and bad. Firstly, the game requires an understanding of the story of the first game to truly be enjoyed. While it is a standalone story, the overall world building established in the protagonist Caleb's first adventure definitely adds to the experience. Now, the overall plot follows Caleb's journey to defeat the leader of a cult-turned-mega corporation while dealing with an invasion of otherworldly creatures. The story is delivered by a mix of cutscenes and environmental storytelling throughout the levels. Now, I've put a lot of thought into how I feel about the story, because originally I thought it was poor. Then, as the game progressed, I started to see the narrative intentions and my opinion changed a little. In the end, I feel like the developers tried to tell quite an ambitious story, but the methods to deliver the story, and importantly sell the immersion to the player, particularly of the environment, don't really support the overall plot's ambitions. I think a part of this is the underlying technology and the limitation of the game's engine, but equally I feel like the plot at times overcomplicated things for no real payoff. I think my main issue with the story is that I never felt like I was part of the overall world like I did with games like Half-Life, Unreal, and Thief. I can't say this about many games, but I would argue that if you stripped the cutscenes out, you could completely rewrite the story for the game and no one would be any wiser, and that's not necessarily a good thing. Now, story is not the only element that makes a good or bad game. At the core of a game is gameplay, and Blood 2 is a mixture of things that work very well and things that don't work too well at all. Honestly, there's really no middle ground here. Firstly, the game is first and foremost a first-person shooter, although as was legally required at the time, it does also include some platforming elements. Game control is very good. Caleb controls well, and even in some of the platforming segments, which I didn't like but accept that they were relatively few in number, I never felt like I was having difficulty because of the control. There's a lot of enemies in the game which shoot projectile weapons, as well as others which close in for melee attacks at high speed, and the Control of Blood 2 delivers on each and every one of these engagements. The only real issue I had with the Control is the weakness of pretty much every FPS from the 90s, and that's the ladders, but honestly, it's nothing too egregious compared to other titles. Combat is also very good. While you're not exactly getting state-of-the-art AI, the enemies you encounter are fairly varied in design, with a good mixture of ones you can easily mow down and others you need to take your time with. This really helps the game's overall pacing because it varies the combat encounters, but still provides a good level of satisfaction in mowing down those lower level enemies, which admittedly is quite fun. Now, while the mainline enemies are quite good, the bosses feel like somewhat of a missed opportunity. There's a boss around the middle of the game, which is essentially some type of giant creature who walks around trying to hit you, and if it misses you but hits one of the room's pillars, the pillar breaks. Now, every single game I have played up until this point in my life taught me that I need to force the boss to break all of the pillars and then something will happen. Well, I did get all of the pillars broken, and you know what happened? Nothing. Nothing at all. And then I just pumped the boss full of shots and he died and the level was over. This is just one example of where the game provides the framework for something unique, but ultimately does not execute on it. On the topic of shooting, I need to mention the weapons, all of which again are pretty good, and the fact you can dual wield a lot of them, while not making a lick of sense physics-wise, adds to the overall enjoyment of combat. There's no reloading for the majority of weapons, with only the most powerful weapons requiring reloads, such as the shotgun and sniper rifle, which again helps to propel the game's overall pace, where to be honest is where the game is most enjoyable. Now, apart from playing as the original protagonist Caleb, upon the beginning of a new game you can choose to play as other members of The Chosen, which is basically a group of people out to save the world. While this sounds interesting, its execution is curious to say the least. Firstly, if you play as any other character apart from Caleb, you don't get any cutscenes in the game, which make an already complex story virtually impossible to follow. Then there's each character's skills. According to the manual, each character has unique traits, such as faster movement speed or being able to take more damage. The problem is that apart from the exposition in the manual around this, it doesn't include this information anywhere in the actual game when making the character selections. There's no benchmark for what each character can offer, and in my experience, they all mostly felt the same. I didn't find a scenario where one player delivered a vastly different playstyle to the other. A nice touch though is they do include their own voice acting for one-liners, which has become a staple of the series, but the voice acting from Caleb combined with his cutscenes really steal the show from a character choice perspective. Now, the overall level design is interesting. Firstly, praise has to be given to the sheer number and variety of environments. Your journey takes you everywhere from trains, cities, construction sites, and even an airship. For the time, this was great stuff as everything feels unique, and I was genuinely interested to discover what the next level would look like. Then you have the actual levels within these environments, and this is where I think a combination of questionable decisions and technical limitations at the time really hurt the overall presentation. Starting with the questionable design choices, there are quite a few levels which include water segments where Caleb needs to swim in order to progress. Now, swimming in games in the 90s was never peak enjoyment, but what the developers decided to add to many of these segments is enemies that latch onto you while swimming, obscuring your view, draining your health, and requiring you to button mash to get them off, all while still swimming. Whoever thought this was a good idea clearly didn't play it themselves, at least not for any extended period of time. It's not fun or challenging, it's just frustrating. Another questionable design choice lies in the progression path in some levels. Now, I'm no scientist or physicist, but I'm pretty sure when you shoot a fire extinguisher, this doesn't happen. Honestly, I was stuck on this stage for some time trying to work out how to progress because I didn't think that shooting an item designed to extinguish flames would blow a 10-foot hole through a solid brick wall, but apparently it does. Then we come to the technical limitations, and this is an area that, as mentioned before, I feel like the aspirations of the developers were held back by the available technology at the time. Take, for example, the train station level. It's meant to be a train station in a busy city, but it's essentially a walled-off cube with a few stationary NPCs. It doesn't feel like a real train station, it feels like a game level designed to funnel you in a very linear path. Now, to be fair, there are not too many examples of where it's abundantly obvious, because for the most part you're engaged in moment-to-moment combat, which, as mentioned, is very good and distracts you from the overall environmental details. Now, given this game required a lot of heavy lifting to be playable on modern PCs and does not officially support the configuration I was playing on, I'm not going to criticise any of the bugs I encountered in the game, which, to be fair to the game, were mostly superficial visual ones anyway. There was certainly nothing close to game-breaking or anything really beyond a curiosity. Visually, the game is a bit of a mixed bag. In the transition from the original title's graphical engine to the sequel, it seems like a certain charm to it has been lost. It's not a bad-looking game for the time, but the overall immersion is certainly handicapped as a result of the relatively low fidelity combined with an art style which hasn't aged particularly well. Sound-wise though, the game is great. All of Caleb's one-liners are here, which does go away in restoring some of that charm lost from the original, and combined with the other characters' voice acting, all produces a fairly solid narrative audio experience. The music, while used sparingly, is good and definitely suits the overall theme of the game. Perhaps the only area of the sound design that I feel could have been improved were the weapon sounds. I can't exactly put it into words, but a lot of them don't sound as impactful as they could. But I do stress this is a nitpick and your mileage may vary. Now, Blood 2 was always going to carry high expectations based on the original, and you can definitely tell that there was a lot of passion put into the game to try and deliver on that promise. But whether it was the overall game engine choice or the convergence of questionable decisions, the game wasn't as well received as the original. There was an expansion called the Nightmare Levels, which, while I did not play through, from my own research, is effectively the same gameplay loop, for good and bad, with some additional story elements. I honestly think that the base game could be remastered and become a lot more enjoyable for new and returning players, because the underlying game loop is enjoyable. In a first-person shooter, you want the control and shooting to be good, and it is here. It's just a shame that other elements conspire to hamper the overall enjoyment. Well, now that we've had a look at the game, we can answer the question we set out to. Blood 2. Was it really that bad? No, it wasn't. Blood 2 is like getting stuck talking with that one person you're trying to avoid at a party. After spending a lot of time avoiding, you discover it isn't as bad as you first thought, just so long as you don't have to do it too often. While having mixed reception, the game represents an interesting time in gaming, where the transition was being made from simple backstories and environments to complex narratives and expansive environments, often with mixed success. But that's enough from me. Do you agree or disagree with my opinions? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.